What's up, guys? Quick little update. The room is still a mess. Let me paint you a scenario here. It's Christmas morning. You just opened up a new gift from your grandma. It's a new digital camera. But wait, you don't know how to use that. Well, I suppose you could put it on auto. Who wants to do that? You want to be able to know how to work that thing. You want to know how to control the light that's going into that camera so that you can expose your image properly. Well, today we're going to learn that. What I want to talk to you guys about today is some very essential camera basics that will help you understand how to work any camera so that you can expose it well and get a good shot. And there are 3 different things that we're going to talk about today that have been talked about in every single camera video I've ever seen, but it's essential because it's the building blocks of photography, and that is aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. And over time, as you understand how these 3 things work in congruence with each other, the more easily you'll be able to expose your camera to get the best result. The first thing up is aperture, and this is actually not something to do with the camera body, but more so the lens that you're using. Aperture can be defined as the opening and closing of the lens's diaphragm to let in more or less light. So the more open it is, say like an f1.4, it's gonna let a lot of light in, and as you crank that number up, it's like f11 or 16, it's gonna close that diaphragm and it's gonna let in less light. And one thing to note about aperture is that when your lens's diaphragm is wide open, that's what's going to create that like really shallow depth of field with like the really blurry background that is so desirable. So when you're looking for lenses, oftentimes you'll get advertised the lowest number that lens can go to, often 2.8, 2, there are even lenses that go to 1.2, and that's just going to open that diaphragm more and more, and it's just really going to give you that shallow depth of field, that like really sharp focus and blurry background that is super desirable in photography. So let's move on to the second essential of camera basics, which is shutter speed. And it is exactly what it sounds like. It is the speed at which your shutter closes and opens. And the faster that shutter closes, the sharper the motion you're going to capture. So let's see what it looks like if you have a slower shutter speed trying to capture motion. All right, so what you guys see is the live view of my camera right now. You can see that my ISO is set at 250. My shutter speed is set to 1/50th of a second, and I'm gonna move my hand like really fast back and forth and try to show you guys what motion blur looks like at 1/50th of a second. All right, so we got it there. Now let's crank my shutter speed up to 1/320th of a second, but you now see viewfinder showing you kind of like what the photo is going to look like. Since I crank my shutter speed up, it's gonna close and open faster, so it's not gonna let in as much light. So to compensate for that, since my aperture is already as low as it can go on this f4 lens, I'm going to increase my ISO in order to compensate for that. And I'm just gonna go pretty high to 2,000th of a second to try to get the same exposure. So now let's see what it looks like at 1/320th of a second. Really fast. So you see the difference between those 2 pictures. You see in the first one, I was moving my hand really fast, but I didn't have a shutter speed to match to capture all of that motion that was happening. But on the second one, we cranked the shutter speed up, so it closes the shutter faster, and I was able to capture more motion. And you see the motion of my hand was caught because I had a faster shutter speed. And the third and final thing we're going to talk about today is your ISO, which is essentially just your sensor's sensitivity to light. So if you're shooting during the day and you've got direct sunlight everywhere, there's no need for you to raise your ISO to make your camera more sensitive to that light. You've got a ton of light source. So the time that you want to mess with your ISO is when you've already maxed out your aperture, you've already opened up the diaphragm as much as you can, you've got a slow enough shutter speed to where you feel like you aren't gonna like shake too much, like your shutter speed's fast enough you feel like you're gonna get a good sharp image without any motion blur, but there's still just not enough light coming in for you to get a good exposed image. That's when you can start cranking up that ISO. But the thing that you want to keep in mind with ISO is that the higher you crank that up, the more digital noise that you're going to introduce to your image. So you'll see in this image right here, I had my ISO cranked up super high. In some of these dark spots, you can see a lot of digital noise there. That's just one thing you want to keep in mind. The more you crank up your ISO, the more of that digital noise is going to show up. So working with all 3 of these things, these are what help control the exposure of the image. And the way that you can tell if you have a good exposure or not is to always use your light meter. So when you look through your camera's viewfinder, you're going to see something kind of like this. And down at the bottom, you're going to see your ISO, you're going to see your aperture, you're going to see shutter speed, but you're also going to see this little bar that has a 0 and has a -123 or a +123. and that's going to be your light meter. So as you mess with your ISO, your aperture, shutter speed, all of that, that's going to help you get that light meter to come to that 0. When it hits 0, your camera is basically telling you that this is a perfectly exposed image. And more than often, you can trust your camera's light meter. So those are the 3 essential camera basics that any photographer needs to know. The more you practice and understand how to control how much light is let into your camera will make you a better photographer. And the more that you practice that and the more that you get it into your head, the more that you'll understand and be able to look at any scene and understand, okay, I need to make my camera settings this to achieve this. Am I outside? Is it super sunny? Am I inside and there's not a whole lot of light? Is it nighttime? Am I trying to get motion blur? Do I want a shallow depth of field? Like, ask yourself, what kind of picture do you want to take? These are the kind of things that you start asking yourself to achieve the kind of photo that you want to take. And the more that you understand these 3 basics, the easier it will be to get the results that you want. I hope that this was helpful to people who are just getting into photography or want to understand kind of how it works. If this did not make a lot of sense, then there are literally a million videos on YouTube that explain the exact same thing. So you can go look at one of those. But other than that, thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you next time.